All right, so you're on notice. Anything you say can and will be used against you, possibly. Hopefully not in a court of law, but certainly the court of public opinion is becoming all the more important and decisive these days, even in the courts of law. I want to begin with a text because then we're going to move into some theory for a few minutes to set the backdrop of today's study and discussion. But the memory text for today is therefore, it's from Hebrews 9:15. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. Hebrews 9:15. And what I'm focusing on in this text and also in this lesson are implications that flow from this word of called, right? Those who are called. We like to emphasize this. God's calling in our lives. God has a call for you. God has chosen you. And we tend to think of it as a very positive and good thing, right? We encourage our young people to have a sense of this specialness, of this calling. And yet, this notion of being called and being special, if it heads the wrong direction, can actually create problems, right? Both individually and in society. How many Christian groups have become somewhat inner focused and even narcissistic because they feel they are special and they are called and they are chosen, and they haven't approached it in a balanced way. And historians would probably acknowledge that this personal sense of calling and specialness has not only bled over into certain groups, certain religious groups being called and special and chosen in ways that others aren't, but this has bled over into whole people groups and whole nations viewing themselves as being called and special and chosen in ways that others aren't. And we have a word we throw around here sometimes to talk about Christian nationalism. And really, Christian nationalism is just a version of religious nationalism. And we speak sometimes like it's a new thing, like, Christian nationalism is, but really, religious nationalism is kind of the default of almost all human civilization through history, right? We think we're better than the others because we have the right gods, and those gods give us superiority. And so these questions of, so the topic that I've chosen for this class, and probably why at least some of you are here, the sanctuary, the chosen, and critical race theory. And I suppose some might think I'm engaging in clickbait, right? Because critical race theory is this controversial topic now. So, anything to connect it with the topic of my lesson will draw more viewers and listeners in. But I honestly believe that our sanctuary message and the notion of the covenant that we're studying this week speaks directly to, and even overlaps in some instances with, concerns that are expressed by those who are holding and promoting critical race theory, which is, it becomes to be called that. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about critical race theory, and honestly, I don't know if we can cover this whole topic in just one Sabbath school class, because I do want to have time for meaningful discussion, but there's also certain content that we have to go through. So Anthony has graciously agreed that if we run out of time, this may be a two-parter. We may be finishing this topic next week. But we need to talk about critical race theory a little bit. There's you could spend a whole semester class on exploring it. But critical race theory, you've all heard about it and read about it. And I'm going to actually claim a little bit of not necessarily specialized expertise, but it is a theory that arose in the legal world, right? The original foundational thinkers of it were law professors. And it actually originated about the time that I attended law school. So I actually first studied this in the early 1990s when Delgado and Bell and so on and so forth were writing. And it certainly has expanded beyond the field of legal studies at this point and has entered history of sociology and all sorts of fields. But at its core, it made certain claims about legal frameworks and environments in history. And I think at its heart, critical race theory says two things. And there's more other things that people add, but I think the core of it is this, that one, it's an attitude, it claims that attitudes of racial superiority exist and have been pervasive in the majority classes, i.e., in the modern West, Western white men and women have created a framework of white supremacy. Now, not white supremacy is like the KKK may argue, where it's based on explicit notions of racial inferiority, although those have been part of it. There's no doubt about that. But sometimes us whites are confused by this claim of white supremacy because we're not the KKK and we're not the Aryan nation. So what are they talking about? Well, I think part of the reason this arose in legal circles was because when you're a legal historian, you actually know factually that much of the modern West was literally based on laws that privileged white Westerners and discouraged and penalized almost everybody else, including Blacks and Hispanics and Asians. There have been laws preventing immigration from those countries. I just did a presentation last week about Asians in the 1920s. There were laws that said Asians couldn't come in, those that were here couldn't be naturalized, they couldn't own land, and they couldn't marry white people, right? This was part of our federal legal system, at least for some decades, until the 1950s and 1960s when those laws were changed. So lawyers recognized that, in fact, American society was built explicitly on what we would call technical legal white supremacy. Now, much of that disappeared in the 1950s and 60s, but historians also know that just by changing the legal framework, you don't change the attitudes and cultural, social patterns that those legal frameworks have brought into existence. And those legal frameworks were originally reflecting those attitudes. So just by changing the law, you don't change those things overnight. So the first is that there has been attitudes of racial superiority. They exist and they've been pervasive among the majority classes. And that two, institutions of power have been shaped and molded by this racial outlook and have negatively impacted racial or ethnic outgroups. And they continue to do so, right? And that may be the most controversial part of the claim, because anyone who has any knowledge of history has to recognize those first elements exist. We've in the past had racially biased and invidious laws. It's just a matter of our historical record. But many white people, and me included until not so long ago, thought, well, look, that was done away with, slavery at the Civil War, and then 100 years later, the Civil Rights Movement, and at least after the 1970s, all that legal apparatus was set aside. And so the question is, but do these conditions continue to impact us and live with us and live with our society? And I guess as I studied history and you see the impact that events and laws have on history, you realize those don't go away in a few years or even a few decades unless explicit efforts are made to make them go away. So, you know, there's a lot of other things that people say go along with critical race theory, but in my mind, a lot of those other things are not essential to it. Controversial claims are made about, you know, only white people are oppressors, or, you know, only white people can be racist, or, well, those are more extreme claims that I don't believe are at the core of critical race theory. And actually, there's a very good article so I don't have to spend too much time on it. I have asked Anthony to put into the chat a link to an article by a Christian theologian that in my mind is the most helpful one I have come across for understanding how critical race theory can be useful and what the limits of it are for Christians. And the author uses this very powerful metaphor. He talks about critical race theory being like a pair of glasses that you can take on and take off. And the glasses are kind of methodologies of looking at the past by especially focusing on the categories of ethnicity and race, and then how that intersects with economics and finances and power and justice, and seeing if certain patterns emerge, right? I mean, this is one way you can look at history, and certain patterns or certain truths might emerge. And as a historian, I don't see anything wrong with that, right? It's just a question of asking the right questions. And a brief example, you've all heard of the Salem witch trials, right? And there was this path-breaking work in the 1970s. The discussion used to revolve around, well, was there anything supernatural? Were there witches? Was it just a group hysteria? And people would argue both sides of that, until an enterprising sociologist did a study, a demographic study about where the accusers lived in Salem and where those who were being accused lived in Salem. And what emerged was that all those that were doing the accusing lived in a certain part of the community where all the people there lived and worked in rural settings. And all the people that were being accused were the people who lived in town and had wealthier and better paying jobs. And it turns out that there really was a class element to this, that if you didn't know about it, you wouldn't understand the full story. Clearly, the notion of witches was a very powerful one in those days, and that it was being used by those that were weaker in power to have more influence in the community. It's almost inarguable that that was an element to it. But was it the whole story? Well, no, I don't think it was the whole story. I don't think you can understand it still without religious commitments and beliefs and other elements. But in a sense, it was like a pair of glasses that actually helped explain more of the story. And then you put your religion glasses on too, and you understand more. So you see what I'm saying, the importance of removable spectacles. Well, there are some people, though, who use critical race theory as not removable spectacles, but as contact lenses. And that's all that you can see. And so everything becomes about race and power, and there's no other elements to the story. And there are certainly people who promote critical race theory that do that. And so it's legitimate. So there's two extremes here, right? There's some Christians who say, oh, everything with critical race theory is tainted, and we cannot learn from it. And I think that would be a mistake, because you miss out on these truths that can be determined, but we still can't embrace it uncritically without exception, or its larger narrative, meta-narrative claims that really this is the prism that explains all of reality, and white people really are oppressors at all times and places, and so on and so forth. All right. So that's a little background on CRT. I put that link of the article in the chat. Read that. There's a very powerful third argument that he makes about, so there's the glasses, there's the contact lenses, and then he talks about tiers, the subjective element of how oppressed groups feel and perceive reality because of their oppression. And a lot of it will be based on reality. Some of it will be based on emotional and subjective experience. And that's not to discount or say it's unimportant. And he points to the Hebrew Bible and the imprecatory Psalms and some of the things the Hebrews said about the Babylonians, for instance, that we wonder, like, how could they talk about taking and throwing their children on the rocks, right? This isn't something that seems defensible from a morally objective point of view. But once you understand the experience of suffering, you begin to realize that some of these things are cries for help and to God that gives us insight into these people's experiences. And it doesn't invalidate them, but it should cause us to be more empathetic towards them. I think it's very powerful. It was an article that actually helped me understand the Psalms better, right? This critical race understanding. Anyway, I highly recommend the article. Go ahead and and read it later this afternoon. But I want to move from that to this question of the sanctuary and race. Let's turn back to Leviticus. And Leviticus 26. In the memory, this was in our lesson for Sunday, Leviticus 26, 11 and 12. And it's so amazing to me how many instances this semester we've had of the Sabbath school lesson pointing to some very important verses and then stopping one verse short from the verse that I think really kicks it over into being incredibly relevant for us today. So Leviticus 26, 11 and 12 talks about how God is going to rescue his people. They're coming out of slavery. Somebody have Leviticus 26. First, let's start by reading 11 and 12. And he's offering a solution to their historical experience and problem. Read it. Yeah, Milton,
Yes. I can read it if you need me to read it.
Online, go ahead. Is that Whitney? Go ahead.
Yeah, it is. I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not harbor you. And I will walk among you, and will be your God, and you shall be my people.
Okay, so this is an amazing passage about God wanting to come and be with the children of Israel, and this is what the sanctuary is about. I'm a bit puzzled by this first passage, though. I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul shall not abhor you.
Abhor you.
Abhor you. It's a very strong word about I will not loathe you, right? Why would this sounds like a very low bar that God is setting for his interaction with his people? I will not loathe you, right? Is this how you reach a people that is have just come out of slavery? I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but I do want to read verse 13. Whitney, go ahead and add verse 13 to that.
Sure. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you shall not be their slaves. And I have broken the bars of your yoke and make you walk.
And make you walk what?
Irked, I think.
Upright.
Yeah, it's upright, right?
Upright.
I have erect.
Yeah, the words I think is erect.
Okay, so there's erect. Some versions have upright, others have erect. So this is the one that really makes the connection for me. What is he talking about? Is he talking about walking physically upright and erect? This is about they've been in bondage and in slavery for at least 200 years or 300 years, right? They've been in Egypt for 400. The slavery didn't start right away, but at some point. And they have been viewed as an inferior people, right? We talk about white supremacy. Well, whites didn't start the notion of ethnic supremacy, or blacks didn't start it by accusing whites of holding it. It's as old probably as the human race is itself, though it's hard to have when there's only one race. But I would imagine soon after the Tower of Babel and things became broken up, one group decided they were the best group. And we know this for the Egyptians. This is just a small discussion from an encyclopedia source. Another important continuity during this period is the Egyptian attitude toward foreigners, those they considered not fortunate enough to be part of the community or the people, i.e. Egyptians. The Egyptian sense of superiority was given religious validation, as foreigners in the land of Temeri, Egypt, were anathema to the maintenance of Ma'at. Foreigners or the community. Foreigners in Egyptian texts were described in derogatory terms. Example, wretched Asiatics, which were the Semites, which were the Israeli nation. The vile Cushites, who were the Nubians, and the Ionian dogs, right? They couldn't write down the name of a foreign people without attaching to it this sort of insult. So Israel had come out of a system of racial supremacy. They were surrounded by people who viewed themselves as superior, and that the Hebrews were naturally inferior and should be slaves. And this obviously had an impact on the Israelites' self-perception of themselves, right? God knew they needed to be both taken out of physical slavery, and they needed to be given a new sense of purpose and of self so that they could walk upright, right? That's what this phrase is about. It's about coming back into having self-respect and confidence as a person. It was only in part the physical chains that were keeping them down. It was a system of oppression and of racial, and I know some historians say, well, they didn't have sense of races then, but they did, maybe not. I mean, there's a technical discussion to be had. But they certainly had a sense of people groups, and that certain people groups were superior, that was them, and others were inferior, right? So this story is about a people escaping from physical and racial oppression, going through, and we had a presentation a few weeks ago about the trauma of this and what you do to recover from trauma. So this is a people that have been traumatized physically and emotionally and in their identity. And now God is trying to bring them out of that, physically as well as emotionally and spiritually. So how does God respond to this? And, you know, that's contained in these verses, right? He's going to respond by doing at least 2 or 3 things. Taking them out into the wilderness. Now, what do these verses suggest? Part of this healing journey, how is he going to make them stand on their own 2 feet? Are there any thoughts about that?
Tabernacle.
The tabernacle, okay. So he uses the tabernacle, and how is this going to help respond to this immediate crisis or trauma? What is it?
Give them a sense of belonging.
They belong to something. They have an identity. He's using in a way that God is going to be amongst them in ways that he's not with other people. Right? So this is a little bit risky. He's responding to racial notions of racial superiority. And I know that there's some discussion in the chat. Okay, I can't use racial, people superiority, tribal superiority, whatever, by making them feel special as a nation. So is this fighting fire with fire? Is this really wise? Or is this going to lead to the same result? And so maybe we need to ask, what is there about how he sets this up that may safeguard against just moving from one nation who believes it's superior to another nation that views itself as superior?
I think instead of God using his point of view, he uses human point of view. And so whatever human beings will understand better, quicker, God, I think, is using that strategy here.
Okay. So how does that stop them from falling into their own sense of superiority?
Can I jump in here?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, when you look at it, God makes it clear that he didn't choose them because they were the biggest and the best and better than anybody else. He makes it clear to them that everything he's doing is because of his might, his wisdom, and for his glory. So he's loving them by providing all their needs coming out of Egypt, but he makes it clear that, you know, it's about him and the bigger picture that they're not yet aware of, that he's providing for the whole world. And by the default, for the Egyptians themselves, even though at the moment it doesn't look like it.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, that they are special because God is with them. They're not special because some innate tribal characteristic that they've had from the beginning. Because if they were special because of that, then why were they in slavery to begin with? And why were they having these difficult experiences? And yet, somebody suggesting he gave them borders so they don't become imperial. No, I think that's certainly part of it, as to David's point. But I do think that there is, as part of the restoration, he doesn't shy away from making them feel like a special people group. And this is something I've appreciated. There's some Christians who are thinking about critical race theory. And I've asked Anthony to put another link in the chat to a blog by a UCLA professor, whose name I've just managed to erase from my notes here. But the blog, yeah, Robert Romero. Robert Romero is a UCLA professor who's a Christian. And he has put some thoughts together about how critical race theory can provide insights for theology. And he also thinks theology can provide insights for critical race theory. But one of his most important points is this, in my mind, is that from a biblical vantage point, every ethnic group of the world possesses distinct God-given cultural treasure and wealth.
Amen.
Right? Every people is a chosen people in some way.
Right.
Not in the same way, perhaps, but they have different gifts and abilities, and they are valuable because they are part of the image of God. And he points to Revelation 21, 22 to 27, the passage that talks about the glory and honor of the nations coming into the New Jerusalem for eternity. What is this glory and honor? The word glory, which is used in this passage, can also be translated as treasure or wealth of the nations. Surely John is not describing literal currency or national government coffers. I believe that he is talking about the cultural treasure or wealth of the different ethnic groups of the world. This cultural treasure includes food, music, dance, literature, architecture, etc., as well as the unique cultural personalities of the world. And I think part of one of the first steps of bringing up a degraded and abused people is to give them an understanding that they are special in some ways, that God has been with them, that they are made in the image of God. Like this is that the sanctuary gives Israel its identity. And I think as Adventists, we're not so far from recognizing this. If you go to our general conference sessions, we always have this parade of nations, right? We get people wearing their native costumes from around the world, and we walk through. We're quite proud of our international diversity. Now, that isn't always reflected in our beliefs and policies and practices, but we do appreciate it at some level, and I think we're capable of understanding and appreciating this particular point, which is a point that I think critical race theory wants us to embrace and learn, and I think which Christians are in a position to contribute to. Make you walk erect, restoration of confidence of a beaten down people. But so that's what God's presence does. It gives them, it restores to them a sense of some sort of specialness and of value. And that's an important thing in a people group. But what else happens at the sanctuary? Are you just, when you go to the sanctuary, are you just told what a wonderful person you are and what a wonderful people group you're a part of? Right? It's in fact, to some degree, it's almost the opposite. The sanctuary is set up to deal with what?
Sin.
The sins of the Egyptians?
Chosen.
Right? And to me,
Well, it's set.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's set up really for judgment. I mean, you think of Psalms. I think it's Psalm 73, right? I was envious of the wicked until I went into the sanctuary and I saw their end. So in a sense, it's set up for judgment for everybody, the wicked and ourselves. because there we are known for who we really are in the sanctuary.
So there's kind of a level playing field in the sanctuary, right? It reminds us
Yes.
it reminds us that we're sinners, and yes, I think the larger message of the sanctuary, it's about power and how God uses power, and He's on trial in the sanctuary, but also people and nations are on trial in the sanctuary, right? And critical race theory is very interested in power, the uses and misuses of it. And I think that Christians are too. That's part of the sanctuary message. It's a critique of the use of power, but it doesn't leave anybody untouched, right? You can't go to the sanctuary just to find out about the misuse of power by the Egyptians, right? It's about your failures too. And I mean, isn't that, to me, that seems to me very much at the core of how the special chosen people can avoid becoming the supremacist, bullying chosen people, right? It's this constant reminder of your own shortcomings and needs for forgiveness. We were pointed towards Hebrews 9:19-22 about without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. You were talking to your Muslim friends about the need for the sacrifice, for this forgiveness. And it's personal, it's individual, as well as being corporate about communities and about nations. But there's no escaping. So it seems to me that this is how Christian insights into this problem of power and race differ the most from some secular versions of critical race theory. And that is, critical race theory can tend, at least some versions of it, to draw lines between the oppressed and oppressors. And the oppressed are on one side, and the oppressors on the other side. And the solution to the problems of world and society is that the oppressors need to know how bad they are, and that they can free the oppressed from the oppression that they're in. How does the sanctuary's view of humanity differ from that? Right? There's some similarities. There's oppressors in the world, and a power is being abused and misused. But how does the observation differ?
Let me jump in before I have to leave. To answer your question, when you have two parties, the oppressed and the oppressor, if it's about power and the parties switch, humanity then becomes the oppressed, now becomes the oppressor. With God as the final arbiter, the one who there is no sin or deceit, that's why we need him to settle the score, because humanity, you give somebody power and then they become the oppressor. So the sanctuary, as we mentioned earlier, is the ultimate leveling field and the only way where we'll get true justice for both sides. And so that's the beauty of the sanctuary. I've arrived at church, I have to go, but it was great. Take care.
Thank you, Gio. So I do think that this is the Christian insight. The Christian insight doesn't erase the fact that at any given time there might be dominant groups who are doing most of the oppressing, and there are minority groups that are going to need help. Like, God is the one that brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. He knows that. They needed rescuing. But he also knew that the rescuing was more than physical from the oppressor group. That the line between oppressor and oppressor doesn't run between people groups, but to use the old cliche, it runs through the human heart, right? And that each individual is capable of being oppressor and oppressed.
Right.
And in fact, we do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that groups that are oppressed, they know how to oppress people within their group, right?
Mm-hmm. And
when you focus on the oppression is only happening out there, you're kind of overlooking a fundamental fact of human nature. Now, I think that that Christians can think about critical race theory and bring this correct anthropology to it, right? And still find the insights helpful. But I want to break for discussion sessions, and maybe we'll only need this week to look at this, but to add one thought to it that will give the question some meaning that I've come up with. Tuesday's lesson talks about the substitution, Christ, sacrifice on our behalf, Christ in the sanctuary. And it introduces for me the idea, last week we talked about theories of the atonement. And do you remember, those of you who were here, Arlene talked about the last one, the modern one, Rene Girard talked about the scapegoat and how humanity, in a sense, society is imperfect, bad things happen, we need a reason for it. The reason can't be ourselves, right? The superior good people. It has to be those people on the margins. And the story of human history appears to be, in good part, the story of scapegoating, right? Of looking at people who are not the Ma'at, like the Egyptians, essentially scapegoated the Israelites, made them the slaves. They deserve it. They're causing all these problems. They're disrupting the feng shui of our community, or whatever it is for your community, right? And we've seen this in our own 20th century, the Germans and the Jews, the scapegoats. What about in our last, presidential election? Scapegoats were the immigrants, the people coming in from the outside who are threatening our jobs and doing this, that, and the other thing. Well, Christ comes and is the perfect person who doesn't do anything wrong, and yet he's scapegoated and killed. And in doing that, it reveals this heart of humanity that scapegoats others. I think this is where my wife and I were talking about this. This exists at the personal level too, isn't it? Is there a problem in your family? Well, you're going to find somebody to blame for it other than yourself, probably, right? It's the dog, it's the cat, it's the kids, it's it's somebody other than me. Happens in the classroom, it happens in the community. How do we relate to that? Do we as Adventists have scapegoats? And how do we avoid that? And I've put 3 questions in the chat that relate to what we've covered so far, and goes over this question of scapegoating. And I'll have Anthony send you out for about 10 minutes, 10 or 12 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll wrap up.